You're listening to the Author Inside You podcast, a weekly podcast designed to motivate you to finish writing a book, choose a publisher, and have your work build an audience. Keep listening if you're looking to get propelled into the next chapter of your life. And now, it's the Author Inside You podcast with your host, Leah and Matt Rafferty.
Hello, and welcome to the Author Inside You podcast. I'm Matt Rafferty.
And I'm Leah Rafferty.
Joining us today is author Michael Walton, who just released his book, a nonfiction work detailing the history of the horror comic book genre from its birth in the 50s all the way through to today. It's called The Horror Comic Never Dies, A Grisly History. Welcome, Mike. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, Mike, what an interesting title. Can you tell us a little bit about the background?
So I actually kind of fell backwards into writing the book. I'm a comic guy from way back. I actually started collecting comics seriously when I was probably 10 or 11 years old, kind of right about the time that a lot of boys do that. Typically you find that a lot of boys grow out of it, and I found that I never did. I actually, at one point in my early 20s, took part of my collection and started a comic shop in my hometown. So I had my own little comic shop for a while. I ran that for a couple of years, and then, life happened. I actually got married and moved out of state. I moved up to Ohio, where I'm living now. And, at that point, I swore, I'm not going to do that again. Still stayed a collector. And there's an old saying that old comic collectors never die. They just disappear behind long boxes. And, as the time went on, I collect, the boxes kind of stacked up more and more. And my wife, I actually met her in a comic shop. So she knew what she was getting into. So, she was definitely long suffering and patient. But, after a while, you start to get the little hints that, there sure are a lot of boxes sitting around. You could maybe sell a few off. So I started, occasionally picking up a table or two at a convention. I went to one. It was about the middle of October. It was a Sunday. And I figured, well, I'm going into a room with a bunch of other people, and we're all selling exactly the same thing. So I need something to kind of differentiate my inventory from everybody else. So since it was October and, Halloween was on my mind, I'm like, I'll take just horror books. And because I had a bunch, horror books are always great. I've been a fan of them since I was a kid. So I went, and that was my way to stand out, and
Great
it seemed
idea.
to work.
Yeah, I bet it did. Yeah. That's
yeah,
your niche,
it also,
right?
it was a good niche, and there were a lot of people coming around, and I had a whole lot of, I remember these when I was a kid, and have you ever heard of these? And I started talking, horror books with some fans, and it kind of hit me. That's like, this is something that it might have some traction there. And so the book actually grew out of discussions that I would have with people, because again, since I've been a comic guy for, I don't know, probably longer than I'd care to admit right now, there's the comic book industry, American comic books started in the late 30s, actually. So they've been around for, 70, 80, 100 years almost. And so there's a lot of history that goes along with it. So, as I'm talking to, the different generations of the comic guys, because there's the people that are, that are my age that are buying books from, they bought the books in the 70s and 80s. There were the older generation that bought them in the 60s and the 50s. The younger generation, they're buying the new stuff. And they all have kind of a different take on the horror genre, because the horror genre has changed from decade to decade, just
Sure.
Society and writers and creative works and everything. So I found, I was having these discussions with people, and, obviously I go over a lot of the terminology of the book, but there's pre-code horror, there's post-code horror, there's Silver Age, Bronze Age, Golden Age. I would get into that. There were people that would pick up books, and it's like, I didn't know that, they made a comic book after this movie. It's like, actually the movie was based on the comic book back in first, and there's a lot of things that people didn't know. So I started down the road of thinking, well, instead of having to regurgitate this information over and over again, I'm like, I'll make like a flyer or something. And I got a little big for a flyer. So I thought, okay, I can put this as information on my website. And it actually got a little big for that. And then the thought started batting around like, there could be a book in this.
Wow.
And I did a little research, and I looked around, and there wasn't really a lot of stuff out there like that. So I kind of plunged headlong down that road, and, kind of put the manuscript in place and started shopping it around to some publishers. I mean, originally I was thinking, as easy as it is to self-publish, I thought maybe I'll self-publish and go that route. But I figured before I went fully down that road, I would try just going and approaching traditional publishers because, what's the worst they could say? No, we don't want to do it.
Right.
And luckily, I had a publisher, a North Carolina-based publisher called McFarland Publishing. They're a small press. They specialize. Their entire catalog is nonfiction. They're a known publisher of scholarly works. And one of the editors there contacted me back and said, "Hey, this sounds like a great idea. Let's move forward with it."
Great.
And so then it became a book after that.
Wow. Well, it seems like you skipped ahead pretty quickly there to the book being written and published. So how did you go about writing the book?
A lot of it kind of broke down pretty conveniently for me because since it is a study of the history of the horror genre from its birth to today, it was kind of, the most logical way was, well, okay, how did the horror comic genre, chronologically, how did the horror comic genre begin in the first place? What was its roots? What was its ancestry? And then as the decades moved through, how did it change? How did the genre change? How did the public's perception of it, the consumers, the people that are buying the books, how did their taste change? And how did just society as a whole change around it? So it kind of lent itself to not quite a decade by decade, but generally a chronological study like that from, like I said, from probably the late 40s all the way up through stuff I've talked about in there from last year, a year ago.
Well, obviously this was a fun process for you, but were there any difficulties, like when you were actually writing, trying to figure out the grammar? Did you have what am I going to do, or were you pretty set on that?
It wasn't really that much of a challenge. The biggest challenge I had was when I had what I thought was my finished manuscript. It was about 20,000 words. And, having never written a book before, I thought, oh, that's great. That's massive. I'm going to be great for it. And, when the editor at McFarland initially approached me, he said, hey, it's a great idea. We want to move forward with this, but your manuscript's a little small. Do you think you can expand on it? I'm, of course, sure. What do you want? He's like, well, really, we'd like to have about 75,000 words.
Oh.
And of course, I'm like, yeah. Perfect. Sign me up for it. I can do it. Send me the contract. So the contract comes in the mail and I sign it and get it back to him. And I sit down and start writing. And I'm like, wow, I just admitted that I'm going to have to triple what I've got written down here. And now I have a deadline to do it. Yeah. So, after that, there was, luckily it was, since I started in kind of I guess, more of a basic outline form, there was some stuff that I could expand on, and some things that I could, some areas that I could run by my wife and say, because she was one of my early editors. She was the first person that I bounced ideas off of, and she gave me some guidance. And it's like, well, why don't you expand on this, and maybe you're talking a little much about that, and you talk about this. What does that actually mean? Where did that come from? So I took some ideas from that and was able to expand it out. And I made my word count, so I was pleased about that.
Excellent. So how long did it take to go from 20,000 words to, what did you say, 70, 80,000?
75. It ended up being about not quite 76,000 when it went to the publisher initially. And that took me roughly a year.
Wow.
So luckily,
good.
Luckily, the editors at McFarland are generous with their deadlines. So no, they told me from the get-go, from before I even signed the contract, they said, your deadline is not set in stone. If it's coming up and you're not going to make us, just let us know, give us an idea of how long it'll take and we can extend it for you. And I did only have to extend it once.
Wow. That is very nice of them.
I was really pleased with that. And I think a lot of it too is, based on the information that I found in Writer's Workshop and stuff. McFarland is, I think, 50 to 75% of their authors are first-time authors. So they kind of know how they know how to handle us with kid gloves, because they know it's like, we have no idea what we're doing in this. I've just got a manuscript. I have no idea how to get this into an actual published book. So they're very patient with that, I guess.
Right. Did it take many query letters to find McFarland?
I'm trying to think. Probably 20 to 30.
Wow,
so
that's pretty
I guess
good.
That doesn't sound bad
in the
at
grand
all.
scheme of things, not a lot. Well, I think what I really had going for me was, since it's nonfiction, you kind of already have your direction picked out. I mean, any publisher can publish fiction, but nonfiction houses tend to publish specific things. So
Okay.
you have there are some publishers that I know of that are local, but they only publish stuff that are, that directly involves, like say Ohio history
Mm-hmm.
or the history of Cleveland or sports. So I knew, okay, well, I'm not even going to approach them. That's not even, they're not going to have anything to do with my manuscript because it's not in their bailiwick. So luckily I was able to find, some of the publishers that publish things on pop culture and comics and things along that line, and that kind of led me down the road to finding McFarland. So yeah, it didn't. I was actually pleasantly surprised at the relatively small number of queries that I had to send out.
Yes, that's great.
Now, do you have artwork included in with your book?
I do not, just because part of it was, like I mentioned, since the fact that I was going to do self-publishing, I had no idea how to go about securing copyrights for it. And
Sure.
then when it actually was signed with a traditional publisher, I was honestly, I was so busy trying to make the word count that it's now looking back on it, I think I probably could have added some artwork, but no, it's just straight text.
Right.
There is some nice artwork on the cover. The art department at McFarland really did an outstanding job. They pulled a cover. It's actually a cover by a known horror artist by the name of Don Heck, and it's the cover of an actual horror comic.
That must be exciting for you.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
cool.
the comic is called Horrific, and it was published it was one of these flash in the pan publishers that they had a few issues, and I think 51 to 52, and so it's an excellent cover on that, and it's one of those that initially in the process, I thought I was going to have to either come up with the cover art myself or, deal with them, and there'd be some back and forth, and they just kind of dropped this on me, and I saw it, and I'm like, you know what? It's perfect. Let's go with it like that. I love it.
Wow. And then what about the copyright on that?
Since they were the ones that came up with all of the artwork and everything, they were able to handle all that. So.
Wow, that is great. Yeah, that's something that you would have been very difficult to do on your own. That is fantastic.
Yeah, I definitely would have. Yeah.
The Author Inside You podcast is really excited to announce that we have a new sponsor.
We've teamed up with Scribophile to help you become a better writer. So at Scribophile, you can upload an example of your writing and get it critiqued by a community of thoughtful writers.
If you're starting the writing process and wondering where will I find the beta readers, Scribophile is a place for you.
And the really cool thing about it is that it's free to join and free to upload your first work. The great thing about Scribophile is that the community reads your work and gives you feedback, and you'll have the opportunity to read other writers' work and give them feedback, which will improve your writing style.
At Scribophile, you'll find a collection of free writing resources. They have a writing blog, a writing academy, and writing forums where there are thousands of writers from all over the world talking shop.
So please check out our new sponsor, Scribophile.com. That's SCRIBOLE.com. You can find a link on our webpage and in today's show notes.
I always find it very interesting how people come up with the books. Like your idea, you never set out to write this book. It's just by you being an entrepreneur, I guess, trying to figure out what's the best way to sell my comic books. And then this led to that. I think that's pretty cool. And what a nice journey it sounds like.
Yeah, it was a good time. It was really overall a fun time for me.
What about promoting your book?
A lot of the promotion actually falls on me because, again, with McFarland being a small press, they do have a staple of conventions that they go to and places that they send out for reviews. A lot of it too, but they also have an arrangement to where obviously they say that as the author, you're clearly the expert on your work, so you might if I had any sources, websites, local papers, or whatever that were specific to the genre that I wrote in that they think would be a good fit for it, that I could just contact them and they would send review copies out. So I'm in the process of getting those set up. I don't have any actual published reviews yet. I have some book signings set up. I also, as I mentioned before, I do sell comics at local comic conventions. So I've got, I usually try to hit 3 or 4 conventions a year. And so obviously that's going to be a big part of what I'll be selling at those, is doing the, kind
Sure.
of the one-on-one promotion at the shows, which that should be a lot of fun too.
Your publisher said that they would cover the cost of sending out advance copies for review?
Yes.
Oh, that's
Yes.
great. Good to know that, because I'm not sure we all knew that a publisher would do that. It always seems, well, especially if you're self-publishing. I mean, you're on your own. You're putting them in an envelope and you're sending them off to, the newspaper or the web page to get reviewed. So that's great to hear that a publisher will do that.
Yeah, my understanding is they'll actually give the reviewer a choice whether they want a physical or a digital copy as well.
Great. So, Mike, what kind of advice do you have for people who have a hobby like you had and are thinking about writing a book because they're so knowledgeable about it?
The one thing is, a book doesn't write itself. Yeah. You pretty much have to put the work in, and it's going to be work. I mean, in the process of this, my wife could attest to the fact that, she pretty much came home from work and saw the back of my head a lot. I was, hunkered down writing. There were nights and weekends and, lunch hours at work. So, there's a lot of slog that goes through, that you have to go through to get the thing done. One of the other ones is, this is probably good advice, even outside of the publishing world, is, it's always best to not be afraid of your own success. I mean, the biggest deal was when I was writing this, I'm like, I'm just a guy that's putting the book together. It's just stuff that I happen to know. And it wasn't until, people from the outside, not necessarily my friends, were starting to be like, well, you've written a book on this, so now you're an expert on it. And initially I'm like, no, I'm not. And then it kind of rings the bell. You're like, okay, well, yeah, I did literally write the book on it. I guess it kind of does make me an expert on it. And at least this, maybe specific microscopic part of something, but, so
well, congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. So
it's nice to have that on your business card. Wrote the book.
Yeah, that's true.
And it's nice that your friends recognized you also.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Well, Mike, what about social media for promoting your book? What kind of plans do you have for that?
I have a Facebook page for my small business, my comic business that I do the shows for. So I do have events set up on my Facebook page for all of those, and also the website for the business. And then I am on Twitter, which I'm in the process of accumulating some followers. Before this started, I didn't have a massive Twitter presence, so I'm slowly trying to build that. So trying to be as active as I can in social media.
With some of your marketing ideas, are you planning on speaking at any local libraries?
I am, yes. I believe it's the first Tuesday in June. The Twinsburg Library has asked me to speak to, they have essentially like a writer's workshop program. So they asked me to come and talk to that. It's going to be, I guess, like an unofficial book launch for the,
Great.
For the event.
Yeah.
So they'll be there. I'm also technically supposed to be hearing something. There was a local newsletter, the Twinsburg Tribune, that I had approached, and they had a write-up and an article for me. And the gentleman that did the interview for that has some connections with other libraries, and he had mentioned that he had floated my name and my book to, I believe, North Royalton Library. That
Great.
They're thinking of having me do something, obviously, when it gets more towards September or October, when it's kind of more Halloween season for them.
The horror season.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm expecting October is going to be probably pretty busy for me.
Excellent. That'll be great. Hopefully you'll sell a ton of books this coming fall.
Yeah, I'm hoping so.
That would be great. So, Mike, where's the best place for our listeners to purchase your book?
Luckily, that all my books available at all major booksellers. So it's in the catalog at Amazon, both physical, and you can get a Kindle version. It's also at barnesandnoble.com, and again, a lot of the big booksellers. It's not, since McFarland is a small press, it's not going to be on the shelf, so you won't necessarily be able to walk into Target and stumble across it. But I think if you can get Amazon and Barnes & Noble, that's going to cover most of your market.
Excellent.
And what about the difference between the Kindle version and the print version?
Just getting it into the electronic version, the format of the pages is a little different, but now overall everything is still spot on.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Mike, for joining us today on the Author Inside You podcast. You gave us a lot of great advice and insight into publishing with a small publisher.
It was my absolute pleasure to be on. Thank you very much.
One of the things that I really like about doing the podcast is listening to people's stories, and I really enjoyed Mike's story.
If you enjoyed the story, we'd appreciate it if you'd share it with a friend.
And please go to the Author Inside You Facebook page.
And there you'll find a TV commercial that we made for the Author Inside You. And until next time,
right on.
Thank you for listening to the Author Inside You podcast. with your host, Leah and Matt Rafferty.